Good morning. I'm Pastor Ryan, and I'm just so glad that everybody could be here this morning. So we've been in a series called The Wisdom and Folly of Kings, and we've been looking at the Old Testament kings and what they did and whether or not they were wise and followed God's ways or foolish and followed their own ways. And as we get in, and as I was preparing for this morning's message, I was reminded of the TV trope, and we see it in a lot of TVs and movies where everything could have been prevented if they had just listened. Whether it was the main character saying the right thing and nobody was listening and they have to go around and clean up the mess, or maybe the main character didn't listen and so now they have to spend the rest of the movie cleaning up their own mess. And it's something that we see a lot where people just refuse to listen, and it just creates bigger problems. And so this morning we're going to be in 1 Kings chapter 12, and we're going to be looking at Rehoboam. And he was the first king of Judah after the kingdom split between the northern kingdom of Israel and the southern kingdom of Judah. And Rehoboam was the son of Solomon, who was the son of David, and David was the king after Saul. And we see a lot of things coming together with Rehoboam and his reign. Because if we back up and we look at Samuel, when Israel came to him and demanded a king, Samuel said that God would anoint a king for him, but the king would eventually take their sons and daughters to work in his service, and he would take all their fields and their grain and their gold, and it would be not something that they would want, that it would be harder than they were expecting. And in that day, they would cry out to God, but God wouldn't listen to them. And we see this prophecy about how the king would be too big for Israel. And they said, we don't care, we want a king anyways. And so David said, God told Samuel to anoint Saul, and then God told Samuel to anoint David after him. And then David to Solomon. And Solomon is often called the wisest person to ever live because he was, in Scripture we see that God told him, I'll give you anything you want, just ask. And Solomon asked for wisdom. And Solomon, being as wise as he was, wrote multiple books of the Bible. But also, even though he was the wisest man to ever live, and he had all this wisdom that was given from God, he was the king that focused on building his kingdom and focused on himself and his own riches and not taking care of God's people. And so Solomon, even though he was the wisest king, he was the one that ended up oppressing his own people. And they cried out for relief. And then his son Rehoboam is the one where we see the decisions that he made. That instead of following his grandfather David and following God's ways, and even following the wisdom of his father Solomon, he turns and does his own thing. So we're going to be in 1 Kings chapter 12, verses 1 through 17. And we see that Rehoboam is going to be anointed king. And so we see Rehoboam went to Shechem, for all Israel had gone there to make him king. When Jeroboam, son of Nebat, heard this, he was still in Egypt, where he had fled from King Solomon. He returned from Egypt. So they sent for Jeroboam, and he and the whole assembly of Israel went to Rehoboam and said to him, your father has put a heavy yoke on us, but now lighten the harsh labor and the heavy yoke he put on us, and we will serve you. Rehoboam answered, go away for 3 days and come back to me. So the people went away. Then King Rehoboam consulted the elders who had served his father Solomon during his lifetime. How would you advise me to answer these people, he asked. They replied, if today you will be a servant to these people and serve them and give them a favorable answer, they will always be your servants. But Rehoboam rejected the advice the elders gave him and consulted the young men who had grown up with him and were serving him. He asked them, "What is your advice? How should we answer these people who say to me, 'Lighten the yoke your father put on us'?" The young men who had grown up with him replied, "These people have said to you, 'Your father put a heavy yoke on us. Make our yoke lighter.' Now tell them, 'My little finger is thicker than my father's waist. My father laid on you a heavy yoke. I will make it heavier. My father scourged you with whips. I will scourge you with scorpions." 3 days later, Jeroboam and all the people returned to Rehoboam, as the king had said, "Come back to me in 3 days." The king answered the people harshly. Rejecting the advice given to him by the elders, he followed the advice of the young men and said, "My father made your yoke heavy. I will make it heavier. My father scourged you with whips. I will scourge you with scorpions." So the king did not listen to the people. For this turn of events was from the Lord to fulfill the word the Lord had given to Jeroboam the son of Nebat through Ahijah the Shilonite. When all of Israel saw the king refused to listen to them, they answered the king, What share do we have in David? What part in Jesse's son? To your tents, Israel. Look after your own house, David. So the Israelites went home. But as for the Israelites who were living in the town of Judah, Rehoboam still ruled over them. So here we see Rehoboam, and he is being made king. And so all of Israel meets at Shechem to anoint Rehoboam as king of Israel. And Shechem was a good place for this to happen because it was in what would become the northern kingdom, and it was in a central location. But also Shechem was a place where many people throughout the Old Testament had met, and it was important to Israel, and because Abraham and Jacob had spent time there. And so Israel saw this as a good meeting place. It was central, and it had all that historical and that spiritual significance. And this was about 40 miles north of Jerusalem, and it was very important. But it's also important because Ephraim and Manasseh, two of the tribes of Israel, that were a little bit farther away and from Judah, and there was some dissent, and they didn't really wholeheartedly follow the kings. But this meeting place, Shechem, was located in the tribe of Ephraim. It was in their territory, so it was kind of another way to help kind of bring Israel together. And that's what could have happened, because Rehoboam's first time and first major decision as king could have united the kingdom. All of Israel came to him and said, "Your father put a really heavy burden on us. Make it just a little bit lighter." And Rehoboam goes to the elders, to the people who had served his father, who were godly people, and they gave him some godly wisdom. They said, "If you lighten that load, if you serve the people now, they will be loyal to you forever." And so they gave him some of the best advice. They gave him really godly advice. And Rehoboam knew it was godly counsel, but he refused to listen. Rehoboam knew that advice was good advice, that it was godly counsel, but he refused to listen. Instead, he went to the people who would not give him a godly answer, but give him the answer he wanted to hear. He went to his friends who said, "No, you don't need to serve the people. The people should be serving you. You can be like your father Solomon in all of his splendor, but you can be even greater. You can have more riches and more power than him. And so tell the people that." And instead of listening to the godly counsel, he listened to his friends. He waited and kept asking around until he got the answer that he wanted. And so he answered the people roughly. And instead of listening to them and serving the people, he wanted the people to serve him. And the consequences of this were the split of the kingdom. And so instead of coming together, and being anointed king and uniting the tribes. He had split the tribes, and this split was, for many centuries, by Jewish people considered one of the greatest calamities, is the split of the kingdom. And for many generations, the calamities and bad things that had happened were measured against the split of the kingdom. And Rehoboam, he sought that counsel. He sought godly counsel, but then he rejected it. And we see him make, in 2 Chronicles chapter 12, if you'll spend some time to flip there, we see him also seeking that godly counsel, but we also see him making the right decision and deciding to follow the godly counsel. And so in 2 Chronicles chapter 12, verses 1 through 14, after Rehoboam's position as king was established and he had become strong, he and all of Israel with him abandoned the law of the Lord. Because they had been unfaithful to the Lord, Shishak, king of Egypt, attacked Jerusalem in the fifth year of King Rehoboam, with 1,200 chariots and 60,000 horsemen, and the innumerable troops of the Libyans, Sukkites, and Cushites that came with him from Egypt. He captured the fortified cities of Judah and came as far as Jerusalem. Then the prophet Shemaiah came to Rehoboam and to the leaders of Judah who had assembled in Jerusalem for the fear of Shishak. And he said to them, "This is what the Lord says, you have abandoned me, therefore I now abandon you to Shishak." The leaders of Israel and the king humbled themselves and said, "The Lord is just." When the Lord saw that they humbled themselves, this word of the Lord came to Shemaiah. "Since you have humbled themselves, I will not destroy them, but will soon give them deliverance. My wrath will not be poured out on Jerusalem through Shishak. They will, however, become subject to him, so that they may learn the difference between serving me and serving the kings of other lands." When Shishak, king of Egypt, attacked Jerusalem, he carried off the treasures of the temple of the Lord and the treasures of the royal palace. He took everything, including the gold shields Solomon had made. So King Rehoboam made bronze shields to replace them and assigned these to the commanders of the guard on duty at the entrance to the royal palace. Whenever the king went to the Lord's temple, the guards went with him, bearing the shields, and afterward they returned them to the guard room. Because Rehoboam humbled himself, the Lord's anger turned from him, and he was not totally destroyed. Indeed, there was some good in Judah. King Rehoboam established himself firmly in Jerusalem and continued as king. He was 41 years old when he became king and reigned 17 years in Jerusalem. The city of the Lord had chosen out of all the tribes in Israel in which to put his name. His mother's name was Naamah. She was an Ammonite. He did evil because he had not set his heart on seeking the Lord. So Rehoboam, he started out seeking the wrong counsel. And he sought the counsel of his friends and asked and waited till they gave him the answer he wanted. And then a few years later, when Egypt was putting pressure on him, he then turned, listened to his elders, listened to the prophets, and humbled himself and returned to the Lord for a short while. And so Rehoboam had walked with the Lord for 3 years after becoming king, but then he turned from the Lord and allowed there to be idol worship and built the high places that were altars and temples to other gods. So because of this, God allowed Egypt to advance on Judah. And Rehoboam, when he saw Egypt advancing, when he saw Egypt coming, and he heard that the word from the Lord that said, because he had turned from God's ways, and because he was following his own heart, not seeking God's heart, that's when God was allowing Shishak to advance. And Shishak was going to destroy Jerusalem, but Rehoboam went and sought his leaders, and they repented, and they humbled themselves. So because of that, the Lord showed mercy, But Rehoboam still had to learn his lesson. And so God said, I will spare Jerusalem today, but you're still going to have to feel the weight of the other kings so you know the difference between serving me and serving the other kings. And so Rehoboam, he divided the kingdom because he didn't want to humble himself. He divided the kingdom because he wanted more power and more wealth than even his father had. And here we see Shishak come and take all of that away from him. And so Rehoboam, he learned his lesson, though. He turned to God and saw that God is merciful. He saw that God, when we turn to him and follow his ways, things work out for us. Rehoboam saw God's power, yet still continued to turn away. Because after this was still early in his reign. It says Rehoboam had been king for 5 years when he was delivered from Shishak, but he still reigned for 12 years. And in those 12 years, we see that he did evil in the sight of the Lord, that he had turned away. And so his sins and the sins of the people who followed left the nation weaker and poorer and in bondage to Egypt and the other nations around him. And so here in Rehoboam's reign, we see 2 times where he consulted counsel, and 2 times where we know what the godly and right thing to do was, and he was told that, but only one of the times did he choose to follow it. One of the times he chose to follow his own heart, to build up his own wealth, not follow God, not follow God's heart, not seek God's heart. The other time, he listened to God's heart and humbled himself, and God showed mercy on him. But in Rehoboam's story, we can see the need for godly counsel. We can see the need to have people who speak into our lives, people who will tell us the right thing to do even when we don't want to hear it. Proverbs 27:6 says that wounds from friends can be trusted, but an enemy multiplies kisses. See, the first time Rehoboam's decision, he went to the elders, and they gave him an answer he didn't like. And so he went to what he would have thought were his friends, and they gave him the answer that he wanted, but not the answer that was godly, not the wise answer. And I don't know about you, but I don't know if you've ever been shocked by the words of somebody who's close to you, where you hear what they say and you're shocked by it, and maybe even hurt or offended, but you realize later that they were right. That what they told you is what you needed to hear, even if you didn't want to hear it. I know in my life and in my marriage, there have been times where Sarah has called out something in me. She's called out pride in me before, and at first I'm like, no, it's not pride. I want to fight against it, but then after realizing that she's right, at first I'm angry and mad, but then realizing upon reflection that she was right, and she was right in calling it out in me. And often when we think of friends, we think of people who we naturally like or have the same interests in us, or who we can naturally just bond with, but that's not always what we need. Sarah and I are very opposite in a lot of ways. But because of that, she can call out my blind spots that I can't see. And so maybe there's someone, maybe it's in your marriage, maybe there's another close friend that you have, someone in a small group, or maybe it's a brother or sister. But we all need that person in our life, that true friend that can call out godly, that can give us godly wisdom. See, we like people that are nice to us and tell us what we want to hear, but a true friend will tell us what we need to hear. They will wound us for our good. See, we see this often in how Jesus talked to people. Jesus was always acting in love, always acting in the other person's best interest. But he didn't always walk around and just tell them the nice thing. He didn't walk around telling them what they wanted to hear. He walked around, and when he talked to people, if they needed to be rebuked, he rebuked them, and he rebuked both his followers, his disciples, and the Pharisees alike. But what's the unbelievable thing about it is that Jesus didn't just wound his friends and wound his enemies with his words. In his actions, he showed that he would be wounded for them. See, he didn't do those accountability drive-bys that we often think of where someone comes up to us and says something that's kind of hurtful and then just goes away and be like, well, you need to hear it, and then just kind of leaves you around to kind of clean up the mess yourself. That's not what Jesus did, and that's not what we should do either. Jesus didn't just tell them the truth and say, like, well, I'm telling you the truth in love. He came full of grace and truth. He told them the truth in love. And then he stayed and worked with them to help build them up. Because just as much as sometimes a rebuke can hurt, we also have the words to help build other people up. And we saw Jesus do just that. Shortly before he laid his life down on the cross, he rebuked his disciples for sleeping and told Peter, he said, as they were making their way to Jerusalem, where Jesus said, I'm going to have to die, Peter stepped in front and said, no, and Jesus told him, get behind me, Satan. And so one moment he's rebuking his disciples, and in the next moment, he's laying his life down for them. See, Jesus' words and actions sometimes seemed harsh, but he did everything out of love and love for us. And so we should thank God when he gives us people like that in our lives. And so there's a few things that we can pray for. We can pray for counsel that wounds us in love. See, we need friends who are willing to tell us the thing we don't want to hear. We need friends and people in our lives who are willing to tell us what we need to hear, not what we want to hear. So we can ask God for them. We can ask God for people in our lives that will speak the truth in love. But we don't want friends who just wound us. We should also pray for counsel that builds us up. See, we don't want to be just wounded. We don't want to hear just the things we don't want to hear, even though if we need to hear them. We need people who are going to walk alongside us and tell us the hard truth, but also build us up and encourage us and help us get to where God is calling us. And we need to thank God for the counsel that loves enough to wound. See, often those friends who speak the truth in love and are willing to tell us the truth we don't want to hear and are willing to wound us, it's often as uncomfortable for them to tell us those words as it is for us to receive them. But we need to thank God for the counsel that does that loves us enough to wound us. And next one's really hard, but we need to invite the wounds from others. See, we need to take the initiative to ask our friends and our counsel to be honest with us. Because it is awkward to say it. And it's not pleasant for anybody to tell the truth that they don't want to hear. And so sometimes we need to be the ones who initiate and ask for it. Psalm 141:5, David wrote, "Let a righteous man strike me, that is a kindness. Let him rebuke me, that is oil on my head. My head will not refuse it, for my prayer will still be against the deeds of evildoers." And so David is writing here and saying, it's good. We should invite the wounds from a friend. We should invite and ask people to tell us the truth that we don't want to hear. And then the last thing we can do is be godly counsel to others. See, we can't just expect other people to hold us accountable, to tell us the truth we don't want to hear. We have to be bold and be that counsel to others. Be that friend that loves enough to wound, but is also willing to walk alongside and encourage and build up. See, the author of Hebrews called us to be aware of unbelieving hearts that can cause us to fall away from the living God. And so to be that counsel to others, it means that we ourselves need to be close to God and ask him to help us turn to him and help us to grow closer to him every day. And so the bottom line this morning is that we need godly counsel. See, Rehoboam, he had that godly counsel and didn't always choose to listen to it. He chose to turn away from it. And that turning away from the godly counsel is what led to the division of the kingdom, to the split of the northern 10 tribes of Israel and the southern tribes of Judah and Benjamin that were Judah, that became the kingdom of Judah. And so in making decisions, we should seek out that spiritual counsel. So let's make sure to ask God to have those friends, to have those close friends, because we're not meant to do this alone. We're not meant to live life alone, and we're not meant to walk in our faith alone. God wants us to be in community with one another. God wants us to have friends that build us up and point us closer to God. So we can ask him for that godly counsel. And we can ask him to help us to be that godly counsel that points others to him.